So I just wanted to welcome everybody once again to the museums. This is the third in the series of our lecture series called Expanded Perspectives of History, which is our series that's supported by the Maine Humanities Council. Again, as we welcome folks in, if you have questions, we're going to wait till the end, but you're welcome to type them in at any point in the either chat or Q&A windows, and then we'll read them out at the end. And just a reminder before we head into this lecture that our next lecture is Thursday, May 5th at 2 p.m. With Professor David Jones, who's going to be talking about giving historical context to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going on disease is our theme for a couple weeks here. For our guest today, Professor Kelton is the Gardner Chair in American History, excuse me, at Stony Brook University. He received his doctorate in history from the University of Oklahoma and has focused his work on the biological processes involved in the European takeover of the Americas in two books, one called Epidemics and Enslavement and another called Cherokee Medicine, Colonial Germs. He continues his research on indigenous experiences with European introduced diseases, with multiple ongoing projects detailing these type of contours of native death and survival during events like the 7 Years' War in North America, American Revolution, and Indian removal. Today, he'll be sharing a little bit more about this work that I just mentioned. Professor Kelton, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Appreciate it, and thank you for all the participants showing up. It's a beautiful day here on Long Island, so I hope that you're enjoying the beautiful weather as well. I'd like to share my screen. I've got some slides. Let's see if I can pull this off. Cynthia, can you let me know if this is good? Can you see this and everything?
Yep. Yes, looks great.
Okay, so first of all, I want to tell you I am speaking to you from my office at Stony Brook University, and this is the land of the Satellicat peoples. I wish to honor them as well as the state-recognized Unkeechug, federally recognized Shinnecock, and then also the Matinecock and Montaukett peoples, whose historical and contemporary homes stand along the nearby waters, both the North Shores and South Shores of Long Island. We are close here at Stony Brook University to Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan, home of the Lenape peoples. And so I wish to acknowledge them at this point. My research has always been on indigenous peoples. That's where I did my, the area I did my graduate work in. And just for a little background, we have 5.2 million self-identified American Indians in combination with other ethnic groups in the United States, according to the most recent census. Of those 5.2, 2.9 million self-identify as American Indian alone. So nearly 3 million American Indians self-identify alone. It's often surprising that people don't realize that the city with the largest American Native population in the United States is actually very close to me, New York City. And when you think about that, that stands to reason because it's a large metropolis that attracts a lot of people. And so a lot of American Indians from outside New York come here to live and work. As well as indigenous peoples from a variety of places in the Americas wind up in the greater New York City area. So the story that I want to focus in on is, how did we get from a land that was inhabited only by indigenous peoples living in countless numbers of communities across what becomes the United States and Canada, and numbers in the millions, more than the 5.9 million today, certainly, but unknown millions. How did we get there to here, to say 1890, when American Indian population was at its nadir? And American Indians possessed only a small fraction of the land that they once did. What explains this catastrophe? And when I was in grad school, in fact, when I went going back to undergraduate days, the explanation that I was given was one that it was disease. And when I was in graduate school back in the dark days of the 1990s, one of the first, actually the first book I read in a graduate seminar was Alfred Crosby's Ecological Imperialism. And this work was, kind of encapsulated his years of scholarly study, in which he explained that disease by itself explains European conquest of the Americas. That indigenous peoples lacked acquired immunity to many diseases that Europeans brought over, and these created these catastrophic pandemics. And most of you who are attending this talk, I assume, probably have a vague understanding, probably even more than a vague understanding of that. Some of you may have read, if you're interested in history, you may have picked up a copy at some point in your life, Jared Diamond's Pulitzer Prize-winning Guns, Germs, and Steel, which he takes the idea of Crosby, riffs on it to expand how Europeans came to dominate so much of the globe. And he takes Crosby's ideas and weaves it into his history of everything book, using germs to explain this conquest. Well, I started in on this project back in the 1990s in my dissertation research, and I did not really understand germs so much, but I was just kind of captivated by this kind of macro historical explanation. And I wanted to dive into it and really explain how the group of people that I wanted to focus in on, the Cherokees, how they experienced this. And so it got me into understanding diseases such as smallpox and the virus here that I'm projecting, understanding things like incubation periods, communication periods, modes of spread, those really basic epidemiological factors that I had no understanding of. And the more I studied the disease and the more I understood how diseases spread from person to person or from point A to point B, the more skeptical I got of Crosby's grandiose explanation, and the more I realized how Diamond's work and others was really hanging on a thin, I don't know what the metaphor is, kind of a thin ice, thin weed, whatever. I understand that you're going to have David Jones talk to you next week, and he may discuss this, and that's very much his ideas as well. I mean, he predates me and coming up with some of these conclusions, and my work is indebted to him. But the more I understood disease and how they spread, the more I understood that diseases alone can't explain the European takeover of the Americas. That epidemics happen in historical contexts, and we need to understand those contexts to understand the indigenous experience with introduced diseases. I came across this kind of aha moment when I was looking at a variety of accounts by the English and the French in the late 19th centuries. And what the English and French are documenting is a deadly smallpox pandemic. And what I did is I put these accounts kind of on a map. I noticed that the folks in Jamestown are in 1696, they comment on smallpox arriving and creating devastation, not just for nearby native peoples, but for residents of Jamestown and enslaved people as well. There's references to diseases striking indigenous peoples of North Carolina in 1690, 1696, 1697. And 1697 and 1698, you see the colonizers in Charleston commenting on the epidemic of smallpox. About at the same time, the French are trying to colonize the lower Mississippi Valley. They're commenting on smallpox having a devastating impact. So I began to question, how did smallpox get from this? I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? How did it get from here to there? Well, what's going on at the time? Well, what was going on at the time was a massive trade network of indigenous slaves. What we know from the historical record is that the English colonists in Jamestown, and as they expanded out into the Piedmont and to the Blue Ridge of Virginia and into North Carolina, they are exchanging manufactured goods with indigenous peoples who are supplying captives. Those captives, indigenous peoples, were then held as slaves on the plantations in Virginia. We know that Virginia allied native groups are moving down into the Savannah Valley and raiding down into Florida in the 1660s and 1670s. South Carolina, established as a colony in 1670, do the same thing, but on a more massive scale. South Carolinians are eagerly exchanging manufactured goods, alcohol, with their indigenous trading partners for captives. And we see English-inspired slave raids into the Mississippi Valley in the early 1690s and into the late 1690s as well. By the time, in other words, the French arrived to establish Louisiana, the English were already there. There's traders living among the Chickasaws. And what are they trading for? Indigenous captives. Well, that was unprecedented in the native Southeast. You had people, high volume of people, raiding through the South, and then human trafficking going back to the East Coast. When the smallpox virus enters that trade network, it explodes into a massive epidemic. Not only does the slave trade allow the smallpox virus spread quite thoroughly through a region, it also put native peoples in a very vulnerable position, particularly those that are being preyed upon by slave raiders. What the French notice is that native peoples of the Gulf Coast are fleeing for their lives. They're fleeing these slave traders, and they're living in these tightly nucleated villages along the Gulf Coast. They comment on how scared they are to go out to hunt, to gather wild food sources, and how difficult it is to farm because of slave raiders. Now imagine living in a tight, a village encompassed around 1 acre of land in which you have a few hundred people fortified inside that area. Once smallpox got into that area, no one could escape. And it hit people that are malnourished, suffering from trauma, and certainly in that situation, mortality rates are going to escalate. What the French observe, in other words, is smallpox hitting not just a virgin population, as other scholars have said, but a population that had been traumatized by colonialism. And that form of colonialism, slave trade, created this massive epidemic. It wasn't just diseases being introduced, but it was disease introduced into a highly colonized environment in which native peoples are already suffering from multiple forms of trauma. So to me, that flipped the script on what Crosby and then Diamond was saying. Diamond was saying germs spread far and wide before Europeans ever arrived. But when you look at the historical record, Europeans are creating the conditions in which diseases spread and did their deadly work. So that was the thrust of my first book. And I think there's certainly more that needs to be explored in this area of how diseases spread far and wide. We do know that there's a massive smallpox epidemic that spreads from the Caribbean into Mexico and into Central America in from 1518 and 1520s. And scholars have conjectured that this smallpox pandemic was hemispheric, that it spread to Canada and it spread to Chile. I'm pretty skeptical, and I've written about that with a co-author of mine, Ty Edwards. She and I published an article in Journal of American History in which we are skeptical that smallpox spread beyond central Mexico in the 1520s, that there are a variety of circumstances that would make it difficult for an acute infectious disease to spread. And I could, I don't want to go into great detail on them, but basically smallpox would run into a dead end when population become more dispersed, and you have geographic barriers that and warfare that stifles the flow of human traffic. But we do know that in the 1630s, there's this massive smallpox epidemic in New England, New York, and the Great Lakes. And this epidemic certainly coincides with the French arriving, establishing a fur trade. It coincides with Puritans and bringing their snot-nosed kids who spread disease, right? We all know that, who have young kids and who've gone to daycare, that we tend to, that's where we get the disease. So when the Puritans are coming over in large numbers and bringing families, they're bringing over those diseases, smallpox and measles in particular, that could survive the Atlantic journey. And then once they're introduced, spread through these trade networks. And as I wrote about, there's this massive epidemic in the 1690s. In the American South. Elizabeth Fenn has written about a massive smallpox pandemic coinciding with the American Revolution. And then, of course, in the 1830s, there's another massive smallpox epidemic that coincides with removal of indigenous peoples to the prairies, smallpox erupting among Plains Indians groups and creating a major pandemic. Smallpox comes to an end in North America for indigenous peoples around the turn of the 20th century. By that time, there's vaccines available, and indigenous peoples, by and large, openly embrace vaccination that's offered to them by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they voluntarily engage in public health measures like quarantine and social distancing as well. And their experience of smallpox comes to an end about that time. So this is truly a devastating experience, but the point I'm trying to make, and forgive me for kind of sounding redundant, is that all of these experiences, we need to investigate them within the historical context they occurred, and not just say it's disease alone, but it's disease within this colonial context. And what I really started out to do is emphasize how indigenous groups have struggled amid these devastating consequences and have survived. Obviously, indigenous peoples have survived, and they're fighting to survive to this day and protect themselves, their sovereignty, and their resources. And this story of survival often is not told in the study of disease and its impact on indigenous peoples. It was what I wanted to set, the story I wanted to tell originally. And the reason I wanted to tell the story is that I stumbled across this very interesting piece of evidence in the archives. And I'm going to get a drink of water real quick. So you guys read that real quick while I sip some water. Okay, you got it? Everyone understood that? I'm kidding, of course. I can't, one thing with Zoom, I can't read an audience. But this is handwriting in the 1830s, and it's actually, for handwriting in the 1830s, it's not too bad. I've read worse, and I photographed this actually, or I guess what's the right word? I read it on microfilm back in the 1990s before a lot of this was digitized. This is an account written by a Protestant missionary, Daniel Buttrick, who worked for the American Board of Foreign Commissioners, ABCFM. Anyway, he's a Presbyterian. I'll put it that way. He's a Presbyterian sent down to the Cherokees to try to convert them in the 1820s and 30s. And he was basically hired by John Howard Payne, who was this famous American playwright in the 19th century. He wrote My Home, Sweet Home. But Payne, along the lines of a lot of Americans, believed that indigenous peoples were the lost tribe of Israel, and he wanted to prove this. And so he commissioned Buttrick to record Cherokee ceremonies. So Buttrick works with some Cherokee informants, and he records this smallpox dance. And the Cherokees explained to Buttrick that smallpox was sent down from the upper world by this spirit called Kusakaskini. And he inflicted smallpox on to Cherokees because Cherokees had lost sacred power, that they had not participated or performed their rituals in a correct way. Of course, Buttrick interpreted that as sin. It wasn't necessarily sin, but nonetheless, we get a view of how Cherokees conceptualize what caused smallpox, kind of a loss of sacred power. Not only that, but we get a view of how Cherokees responded to smallpox. That smallpox, once smallpox was perceived to be around, once this spirit, Kusakaskini, was seen to be Roman, Cherokees closed their villages off from the outside world for a 14-day period in which no one was supposed to go outside the village and no one was supposed to come in. And during that 14-day period, they consumed sacred medicines, they prayed, they fasted, and they ended with a feast. And this was a way of closing their village off. We would call that today social distancing. And this ritual was something, it just blew my mind when I read it, because no one talked about how Native peoples actually tried to keep themselves from getting sick. It was just assumed that Native peoples kind of basically rolled over and died. They were fatalistic. They didn't have any defense. Well, they did have a defense. And the more I got into this, the more I realized that not only did they try to perform these rituals, but medicine people played pivotal roles in protecting their community members from exposure by warning them of going into places like Charleston, by warning them to going to Pennsylvania to fight against the French during the 7 Years' War because they might get infected. And so we miss that story. And that's the story I write about in my second book, Cherokee Medicine, Colonial Germs. But we have to also acknowledge that while Cherokees and other Native peoples could protect themselves, it was very difficult to protect themselves in a colonized environment. And we definitely see this in Cherokee history in three particular circumstances. First, there is a war against the British in 1759 through 1762, in which Lord Geoffrey Amherst, the commander of British forces, ordered scorched earth tactics against the Cherokees to basically starve them into submission. And what this did is created Cherokee refugees who then became infected and spread the disease to other people. So they were not really, in that circumstance of the war, able to protect themselves. During the American Revolution, the Americans organized militias in 1776 to invade the Cherokee Nation, and American militias burnt every Cherokee village down to the ground. And because the Cherokees were, of course, fighting to protect their land, and the Americans were, at that time, invading Cherokee territories, the Cherokees, of course, took weapons from the British to fight the Americans, and the Americans retaliated with these excruciating tactics. During that time period, the Cherokee population plummets. Largely because of violence. But in that circumstance, when people are hungry and they're in a refugee status, their immunity wears down, their vulnerability increases, and their mortality escalates. And of course, the last experience that I don't write about in Cherokee medicine, but is certainly a very traumatic experience for the Cherokees and their experience with disease, was Indian removal in the 1830s as a result of Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policies. Cherokees, of course, are at the point of a bayonet, herded out of their homes, put into stockades, put onto filthy steamboats, and of course sent down to Indian Territory, what is today Oklahoma. And it's that process, they are infected by a variety of diseases, not so much smallpox at the time, but whooping cough, measles, typhoid, dysentery, other diseases that had a devastating impact. Had they been left alone and allowed to stay on their homeland, of course, they would not have that experience with disease. So yet again, another reason why we need to be very careful of the way we talk about Native experience with disease and not just paint with this broad stroke that diseases unintentionally did the deadly work, leaving a widowed land for European takeover. So that struggle that I'm talking about involved disease avoidance strategies that, don't go to places that diseases are. Close your villages off from the outside world. That can help, but often those were difficult because of warfare. Another aspect of the struggle is rebuilding after population loss. When Native peoples experienced an epidemic, they certainly wanted to repopulate their communities. Sometimes they did that by taking captives and adopting them into their villages, but also they did through natural reproduction. There's clear evidence that the Cherokees, after their war with the British in 1759, 1762, they are purposely trying to have more babies. They want to have more babies to rebuild their population. They're very conscious of this. But what follows after that war? The American Revolution, which their population takes another hit. So even if diseases have this deadly impact without much help from the larger aspects of colonialism, colonialism comes in and retards the ability for indigenous peoples to recover that population loss. And so it's with continued colonialism from the 1800s on up to the 1970s that really makes it difficult for native populations to rebound. So that low number in the 1890s, that low number is not just because of diseases introduced, it's because of ethnic cleansing, genocidal violence, ecological warfare meaning against the buffalo herds, which were purposely exterminated to force native peoples onto reservation. Reservations were often the worst places to be because people are to live in confinement on marginal land that was difficult to farm, in which food was scarce and hunger increased. Of course, another aspect of colonialism is coerced cultural change, meaning native peoples were not allowed to practice their religion, practice their language. Those have biological impacts. They're demoralizing and traumatic, which weakens the body. Coerced cultural change also meant boarding schools. In beginning in the 1870s on up to the 1960s, really you see native parents have little choice but to have their children sent away to distant boarding schools in which they were completely an effort was made to completely transform them by cutting their hair, forcing them to wear woolen uniforms, living in dormitories, eating strange food, being subject to kind of a real regimen of getting up at a certain time in the day and saying your prayers and working the fields and going to schools, et cetera, et cetera. That was a very traumatic experience for young kids young as 3 and 4 and 5 years old, sent away from their homeland. The mortality rates in boarding schools was something that we are increasingly learning, and it's very shocking. And we know this much more in Canada than we do in the United States. But many kids went to these boarding schools and they didn't come back. They died from tuberculosis, measles, whooping cough. And then on up to the post-World War II era, there's certainly evidence of forced sterilizations in Indian Health Services hospitals and clinics, which Native women go to, pregnant Native women go to these clinics, they give birth, and then the Indian Health Services believe exercising their kind of paternalistic authority in a new welfare state created during the 20th century, sterilized women against their will. And we have ample evidence, and that's part of this story as well. Now, I know many of you probably out there are probably asking and wondering about purposeful use of germs as a tool of genocide. And you hear that. Let me talk a little bit about that and maybe complicate that story a little bit. So we do know that there is an example of a colonizing force using smallpox as a weapon against indigenous peoples. And that documented case happened at Fort Pitt in 1763. This was during what's called Pontiac's War, Pontiac's Rebellion, in which indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes and Ohio country tried to stop the British takeover of that country. The British came in after defeating the French, occupied French forts, built new forts, brought in military. Around the forts, there were settlers that came to supply the forts. And no one asked the indigenous peoples whether this would be okay. And indigenous peoples rose against this and destroyed several forts. They really knocked the British back on their heels, taking over many forts along the Great Lakes and in the Ohio country. And then they laid siege to Fort Pitt. Fort Pitt held out. Inside Fort Pitt, there were some settlers who escaped and went in, and they had smallpox, and they were held in a smallpox hospital. Well, a British soldier in the fort decided that he would give a gift of blankets and handkerchiefs out of that smallpox hospital to visiting Lenape diplomats. And he wrote in here in a very kind of sinister language, I hope it will have the desired effect. And what effect he hoped is that he would take this smallpox-laden material back to their villages, and it would spread the disease, and it would knock out the native peoples and relieve the siege. And in fact, William Trent, who had been a trader trading goods to the Indians before the 7 Years' War, it was his goods, it was his blankets, it was his handkerchiefs that were used. And so he wanted reimbursement for this. So what did he do? He took the receipt and he sent it up the chain of command, and it was endorsed by the commander of Fort Pitt, and then approved by the time it reaches the high command. General Thomas Gage was in command. He signs off on it for Trent to get reimbursed for an act of biological warfare. So this is the documents here, all right? So we know this happened. What we don't know is what impact it really had. Did it create an epidemic? I haven't seen great evidence that it did. And I think there is evidence that it didn't, because most of those native groups had had smallpox about 10 years before. And so they were largely immunized against smallpox. And so it would not have that effect that Trent desired it to have. But nonetheless, it does reveal kind of the sinister act was implemented. Now, there's another kind of parallel story going on here. While Trent is doing this, Lord Geoffrey Amherst, back in 1763, he is the British High Commander. And this guy, he was a real jerk, to put it bluntly. The British High Command, they were very arrogant, and they did not look highly upon indigenous peoples. They didn't look highly on American settlers, for that matter. But Amherst was particularly vitriolic about his in his language. And he pens a letter to his second in command, Colonel Henry Bouquet, who is on his way to relieve Fort Pitt. He's marching to Fort Pitt. And as he's marching to Fort Pitt, Amherst pens this letter. It's kind of a famous letter. You might have heard the language before. He's wondering, hey, can we figure a way to purposely infect native peoples? This might work for us. Bouquet writes back. Bouquet's a little nervous because Bouquet had never had smallpox before. And so he doesn't want to be the one handling this stuff. That's kind of always the danger of germ warfare, right? You create a deadly biological agent, it might come back to bite you because it may not be controllable. And that's, one of the issues that, ongoing throughout history. For that matter, chemical warfare as well. So Bouquet writes back. He will try, but he wants to be careful that he doesn't get the disease himself. Then Amherst follows up and say, you will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of these blankets. And of course, it's a genocidal statement, basically. Use every method that you can to extirpate this race. And extirpate is a word for extermination, or what we would call genocide today. Now, did Bouquet actually follow through with these suggestions, requests, orders? What are they? Some historians say, well, they were kind of sinister musings. We can't be sure. And we don't know whether Bouquet, once he got to Fort Pitt, whether there was a second attempt following the attempt of Trent. We don't know. But we do have a paper trail of an idea of this that leads us to think, well, did it happen more often? And well, here's where I want to complicate things, I guess. This is one documented case of an actual effort, and then a second documented case of an actual thought process. There's some musings throughout history of hope, wishful thinking, kind of sinister wishful thinking that germs will do the dirty work. But we don't have hard evidence of broader practice biological warfare against indigenous peoples. My argument that I make in Cherokee Medicine is that that idea, and I'm guilty of this right now by dwelling on this, that it kind of leads people to get kind of caught up in that debate in which we don't know the answers for, that we forget what really happened. And what really happened is there's ample evidence of ethnic cleansing, Indian removal, Cherokees being forced out, that had biological impact. Andrew Jackson, he wasn't president. Martin Van Buren was president during Cherokee removal. Martin Van Buren didn't intend for the Cherokees to die. He didn't say, I want them to be on the Trail of Tears so they'll get infected and die. But they fully knew that by removing indigenous peoples, that they would perish because of these diseases, and they did it anyway. Genocidal violence in California. It's planned and organized from the local to the state level, and the federal government picked up much of the tab. And the U.S. Army looked upon a blind eye of what the California militias were doing, hunting down purposely to exterminate Native peoples. When those Native peoples are chased from place to place and they finally wind up under U.S. protection on barren reservations, they become sick and they die. There's a connection, in other words, between germs and genocide that is there, but it's not this kind of calculated plan that Amherst had. It's kind of a natural outgrowth of the use of violence. And that's what we need to focus on and think about and teach people, rather than getting to conspiracy theories that we ultimately can't prove. So survival. I think it's very important when we think of Native peoples and why they survive today, why there's 5.9 million or more people that are self-identify of being indigenous descent, is that their survival to this day depends on Native peoples exercising sovereignty. We certainly see the importance of sovereignty. That is, indigenous peoples having control of their nations, being the political authorities over their members, including running their own health systems. Since the 1970s, federally recognized indigenous tribes has exercised their sovereignty by running their health care systems. And that has put more trust in indigenous peoples to go to healthcare clinics, to go to hospitals when sick, and to become vaccinated. And that has been crucial with their experience with COVID. What you see with COVID, of course, is indigenous peoples' mortality is higher than the general population from COVID. And that's complicated. That's complicated because many indigenous people's health has been compromised by generation after generation of colonialism, living in areas of food deserts, for example, that have high rates of diabetes, for example, high rates of alcoholism. Those factors are those kind of predisposing conditions that are really not kind of inherent in the body, but are social determinants of health. Those have led to high rates of COVID mortality. But we also see very high rates of vaccination on indigenous reservations. The Navajo, for example, have done a great job of vaccinating their people, getting their people vaccinated. Why? Because their president, a Dene person, has really advocated for this. It's not coming from the heavy hand of government. It's coming from the Navajo government and from the ground up. The Cherokees have done a very good job of vaccinating their people. And now, of course, there's been some strife too. We can look at the reservations in South Dakota. What they intended to do originally was to close themselves off to prevent traffic from going across. And of course, they ran into a governor who was a loyalist of Trump, who tried every effort to keep the South Dakota Lakotas from protecting themselves. And there's always that struggle. But by exercising their sovereignty, they protect themselves, and they'll do much better fighting these diseases that are now new and being introduced. Lastly, I want to close here. I appreciate your patience and the time here. I think I'm right about at 40 minutes, which I think is long enough. But there's tremendous diversity in Indian country, and I think that needs to be appreciated. Some tribes are struggling tremendously with poverty, with healthcare because of living in food environments, living with limited means to develop healthcare systems. And other tribes are doing fairly well in that. I was shocked from seeing this picture. It's from, I grew up in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. I'm not a member of the Cherokee Nation, but I grew up in rural Oklahoma, very impoverished communities, and during the 1970s and 80s when I was a boy. But since then, the Cherokees have brought in a lot of revenue from gaming and other enterprises, and they have built this state-of-the-art healthcare facility in Tahlequah, their capital, and have done just a marvelous job of outreach. And in fact, the Cherokees had surplus of vaccination, and they were encouraging non-Cherokees to come in and get vaccinated. So it's the indigenous nation there that's really leading the way in a conservative state like Oklahoma that had a Trump loyalist governor who was also a member of the Cherokee Nation, resisting vaccine. But the Cherokee leadership, Principal Chief Hoskins, really taking a leadership role in public health. So I will leave it at that. I certainly would love any questions that you might have. I will stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was really interesting. And I just want to, oh, I see we have a raised hand. Ted, so before I call on Ted, I just want to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, there's multiple ways to do so. We have a chat box, Q&A feature down the bottom. Those are both typing. You can type your question. I'm happy to read it out. And then Ted, I see you have your hand raised, so I'm just going to press the unmute button and you can just ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Kelton. I'm fascinated by what you said. I've been in public health for 50 years, and in one part of that was working with the Cherokees in North Carolina, and that was before you were born, probably, and sub 50 years later or 40 years later in Maine with the Native Americans in Maine, and that I have my whole life thought that, without knowing, that, well, if we'd enabled to let the Native Americans do what they can do, we wouldn't have all these health problems. And I've said it all my life, and I've said that, and I feel it, and I get a lot of yeah, right, and I work with the Indian Health Service, and they're part of the Borg Empire, the way I see it, and if you use that expression, and that I strongly feel that, and you have confirmed that with your work and your own thing, and I'm just thrilled. I want to thank you very much for that. I have no question, except that I'm just so blown out. Hey, 50 years I've been, getting shot at for having this view.
Well, thank you for your work on that. And well, I think it's a big lesson that you have to have buy-in, right? I mean, you can't just come in from on high and say, I have the solutions to everything. We're learning that with vaccination programs, right? So but it's been a very difficult lesson, I think, for Indian Health Services, because just the many generations of trauma that Indigenous peoples have suffered, and the lack of trust, and it takes people like you who listen and are willing to advocate to reverse that. So I think thank you for that.
Listen, but got nowhere because there was too much of a blockage on the other side from the health services. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, find my unmute button here. So Steve has typed a question that says, have you found any evidence of disease transmission to Spanish-occupied areas of Florida and west of the Mississippi?
Disease transmission from those areas to indigenous peoples, or from indigenous peoples to those areas?
Good question. Steve, do you want to, here, I'm just going to select, you can unmute and say it into your microphone, or you can type it into, oh, both. Okay, yeah, so Steve says both of those things.
Well, I haven't necessarily. I think what the Spanish in general had very weak trade networks beyond the areas that they immediately colonized. So if you take New Mexico, they're not sending out great numbers of traders great distances like the British and the French did. And what we see is, as the Spanish expand northward from central Mexico, and they establish the Camino del Real, the road that basically connects Mexico City, and it's eventually up to Santa Fe. As the Spanish build that road and increase the traffic, then diseases come. So it's not until there's very good evidence that there's not a massive epidemic that hits the pueblos in the Rio Grande Valley until the 1620s. And we see this through tree rings of all things that, I say we, it's not my way of research, but the scholarship that's been done is that archaeologists have found abandoned villages, and they discovered when trees started growing on those abandoned villages, and they can date that to the 1620s. And that's relatively late for a massive epidemic to come. But it does kind of verify that you have to have, a communication network. Now, beyond that, I don't know if, there are epidemics that hit, the Southern Plains in 1710s that probably came up from Mexico. Did they go much beyond? I don't know. But we just need more work, and it's hard work to do. But a lot of it is kind of informed conjecture. You're not, you don't have people writing, necessarily day-to-day accounts of what's going on with, say, the Comanches in the 1710s. But we just need more work on that. But largely, the most massive epidemic that hits the plains is that 1770s, 1780s. And yeah, New Mexico becomes kind of a hub in that spread, where it originates in Boston and spreads down through the South as armies are forming, and it's circulated through ship traffic, and it winds up in Mexico City in 1779, I think, spreads up to Mexico City and hits the pueblos in 1779, 1780. By that time, you have, of course, equestrian peoples that can travel great distance. And as Elizabeth Fenn does really brilliantly in her book, Pax Americana, she suggests that it flows from that the equestrian peoples on up to Canada. Now, that probably wouldn't have happened in the 1620s because, that's really before you see equestrian peoples develop in that area.
Wow, that was a fantastic explanation. And I just thought of one when you were speaking. You referenced that it's not like there's an obvious place that you go to look for all of these things. So more work has to be done. Where do you even start to look for, primary resources on whether disease was spreading?
Yeah, it's so let me just, I guess, be a little bit concrete here. So 1518, we know smallpox spread by way of Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs. We have documentary records. The Spanish are writing about it. And of course, they're interpreting in a certain way, but, we can be reasonably sure that there's a massive smallpox epidemic that hits the Aztecs 1519 into the 1520s and weakens them and allows kind of Spanish to take over. So then the question becomes, well, could it have spread a great distance north? Could it have spread a great distance south? One area you might look at is the archaeological record. So let's And historians have done this. There's studies of the Mohawk Valley, for example, in New York. And there's archaeologists going back to the 1980s that have asked that question. Well, could it have been that disease could have spread as far north as New York, or maybe come in from bass fishermen coming from the North Atlantic that had that brought these diseases to groups like the Mohawk? Well, what they do is they look at the villages and they can date the villages when they were inhabited and when they become abandoned. And what the archaeologists determined, actually, Mohawk villages are growing in size during the 1500s. And it's in the 1630s that you see villages shrinking and village sites kind of disappearing. Now, the disappearance of a village doesn't mean that it disappeared because of disease. I mean, native peoples could, move because of an enemy. They might deplete the firewood sources. There's a variety of reasons. But the disappearance matches up with the documentary record that we know. The French and English documented pandemic of smallpox at that time. So we connect the dots, so to speak. That's kind of how we do it. And you have to understand, like I said, the nature of diseases. Smallpox, why does it spread farther than other diseases? Because it has that lengthier incubation period of 10 to 14 days. And a lengthier communication period, up to 14 days. And it can spread through scabs that are, in fairly dry and cool environments, but heat and humidity will kill the virus. So you have to factor in all those. So smallpox, yeah, maybe. Influenza, probably not, because influenza, 2 to 6 day incubation period, maybe a week communication, doesn't survive outside the human host. You're not going to have a massive influenza pandemic until you have an integrated transportation network. Why does it become a global pandemic in the late 19th and then again in the Great One in 1918? You got massive numbers of people moving across the globe fairly quickly, mobilizing young men in basically petri dishes, ships. So you have to think about all of those factors in order to kind of put together the best case scenario. The last bit of evidence I'll mention is oral histories, native oral histories. And I use that in Cherokee medicine. The Cherokees speak of their experience with diseases, and they very interestingly date. They don't specifically say 1690s, but they make references to people coming into their homeland that we do know came in the 1690s. And it was very interesting that their oral history matches what the documentary record says. So, native peoples might refer to a great epidemic and such coming in. And so that's kind of how we do it. It's not perfect. It's not like, you have a chronicler and newspapers writing this every day that you can hang your hat on with more certainty.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you. As Diane just said, fascinating presentation.
Oh,
I agree. I'm going to give everyone just 30 seconds more if you want to type a question in. And I guess I will ask just another question as we wait in case anyone has one. And this is kind of a simple one, Paul, but I was wondering, I was thinking back on my own college days. I majored in history, and we certainly, I think I was probably a student right when Guns, Germs, and Steel came out, so that was like the heavy teaching period of that. So in terms of what you're talking about today, is this something, are you lecturing about this in your classes now, or is this what's the new thing being taught?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, I teach, I teach my stuff. So, and I use Guns, Germs, and Steel is part of the AP history curriculum. So students come in, they know it. I have 2 teenagers right now who do this. And so they're like, oh, don't get dad started on Jared Diamond again. And David Jones, don't get him started on Jared Diamond.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of, in some ways, like shooting fish in a barrel, because they come in with that understanding already. But I think we have to question why. Why is, why are the folks at AP wedded to this idea? And I don't think it's just sloppiness. I think it's simplicity, the desire for simplicity, simple explanations of why things happen.
Yeah.
And, it's very hard to get into nuance with a younger generation. In terms of academia, I think, we're making inroads. I hope so, but will pick up a college textbook and they'll still incorporate the virgin soil thesis uncritically, not understanding that it really hides a lot of the violence that happened, or it kind of gives readers, students permission to not think about the devastating consequences of human decisions
Right.
that were made.
That's fair. It's a good way of saying it. So I don't see any more questions. So I want to thank you, Professor Kelton, for joining us today and for presenting such an interesting topic and making us all think a little bit more, I think. And then I just want to remind everyone, as I said, our next lecture is May 5th with the person that Professor Kelton just mentioned, David Jones. So
Very good.
After that
You
one,
gotta come see him.
yeah. Oh, nice. We have a we have a good view. So thank you, everyone, and then we'll see you next time. Thank you,
Thank you very
Professor.
much. Thank you.